when 5 men who controlled the fate of thousands simply vanished from a locked meeting room, leaving behind only their cigars still burning and a single word carved into the mahogany table. The question wasn't just where they went. It was what they had discovered in the weeks before that made someone, or something, decide they could never be allowed to speak again. Charleston, 1844. A city built on secrets that the soil itself seemed desperate to keep buried. The invitation arrived on October 14, 1844, delivered by private courier to 5 of Charleston's most influential plantation owners. Each envelope bore the same crimson wax seal, a ship's anchor intertwined with cotton bolls, and contained identical cards printed on expensive cream paper. A matter of collective urgency requires immediate consultation. October 23rd, 8 o'clock evening. The Wellington Club, Private Chamber 3. Attendance is not optional. Burn this invitation. No signature. No explanation. Colonel James Hartley received his at breakfast. At 62, he owned 4 plantations stretching across 3 counties, with nearly 800 enslaved people working his lands. His cotton empire had made him one of the wealthiest men in South Carolina. The old colonel turned the card over in his weathered hands, studying it with the careful attention he'd learned during his military service. He didn't burn it. Thomas Brennan, 38 and ambitious, read his invitation in his study while reviewing ledgers. His single plantation was smaller, but his innovations in cotton processing had caught the attention of textile manufacturers in England. He was the kind of man who believed the future belonged to those bold enough to seize it. The invitation troubled him not because of its mysterious nature, but because he couldn't identify who had sent it. In Charleston's tight social circles, anonymity was nearly impossible. Richard Ashby, 45, was known for his meticulous record-keeping. Everything that happened on his 2 plantations was documented in leather-bound journals he maintained personally. When his invitation arrived, he immediately began a mental catalog of who might have sent it and why. The anchor and cotton seal was unfamiliar, which was unusual. Ashby knew every prominent family crest and business seal in the region. William Foster, at 51, was perhaps the most respected of the 5. His family had been in Charleston for 3 generations, and his approach to plantation management was considered progressive by the standards of the time, though still built upon the same foundation of forced labor that made all their fortunes possible. Foster kept private journals, never shared, that suggested a man wrestling with contradictions he couldn't resolve. The youngest was Marcus Landry, 33, who had inherited his father's plantation only 2 years earlier. He still carried the nervousness of new wealth, always worried about making mistakes that might cost him his position among Charleston's elite. The invitation made him anxious in ways he couldn't quite articulate. None of them burned their invitations, despite the instruction. Over the next 9 days, each man tried to determine who had sent the mysterious summons. They made discreet inquiries among their social circles. They examined the paper quality, the printing technique, the wax composition. Brennan even consulted a printer who confirmed the cardstock was expensive European paper, recently imported. The Wellington Club was an exclusive establishment on Meeting Street, where Charleston's wealthiest men gathered for drinks, cigars, and the kind of business discussions that shaped the entire region's economy. Private Chamber 3 was on the 2nd floor, a room used for confidential meetings. It was windowless, soundproofed with thick velvet curtains on the walls, and could be locked from the inside, a design feature that gave the room its reputation for absolute discretion. On the morning of October 23rd, Colonel Hartley mentioned the invitation to his wife at breakfast. She noticed he seemed distracted, distant. He told her not to wait up, that he might be late. He didn't tell her he'd been having trouble sleeping, or that he'd begun checking the locks on doors and windows with unusual frequency. Thomas Brennan's wife noticed her husband had taken to carrying a small pistol in his coat pocket, something he'd never done before. When she asked why, he dismissed her concern with a wave and changed the subject. But she saw the way his eyes kept moving to the windows, as if expecting to see someone watching. Richard Ashby spent the afternoon of the 23rd burning papers in his study fireplace. His wife heard him doing it and found it strange. Her husband never destroyed records. Through the door, she heard him muttering to himself, though she couldn't make out the words. William Foster visited his family's church that afternoon. The rector later recalled that Foster seemed to want to speak about something important, but couldn't find the words. He knelt in prayer for nearly an hour, alone in the empty sanctuary. Marcus Landry wrote a letter to his sister that morning, sealed it, and left instructions with his house staff that it should only be opened if something happened to him. The letter would later disappear before anyone could read it. October 23rd, 1844, dawned grey and cold. A fog rolled in from Charleston harbor, thick and persistent, muffling sounds and reducing visibility to mere yards. Locals said it was unusual for the season, the kind of fog that made the city feel disconnected from the world, isolated in its own pocket of time. By evening, the fog had intensified. Street lamps cast weak halos of light that barely penetrated the grey murk. Carriage drivers navigated by memory rather than sight, horses moving slowly through streets that seemed emptier than usual. The Wellington Club's doorman, a free black man named Henry Webb, kept careful records of arrivals and departures. It was part of his responsibility. His logbook would become crucial evidence later. Colonel Hartley arrived first at 7:47 p.m. Webb noted the colonel seemed agitated, looking over his shoulder as he entered. Hartley went directly to the second floor without stopping in the main parlor. Thomas Brennan arrived at 7:52 p.m., accompanied by no one, though he paused outside as if speaking to someone before entering. Webb's notation would puzzle investigators. Richard Ashby came at 7:55 p.m., carrying a leather portfolio under his arm. Webb noted he clutched it tight, would not let me take it. William Foster arrived at 7:58 p.m., and Webb recorded that Foster, asked if the others had arrived, seemed relieved when I confirmed. Marcus Landry was last, entering at exactly 8:01 p.m. Webb wrote that the young man appeared pale, asked if we'd seen anyone unusual around the building tonight. 5 men entered. Webb noted them all proceeding to the second floor, to private chamber 3. The door was solid mahogany with a brass lock. It could only be locked from inside, and there was no other entrance or exit to the room. At 8:03 p.m., Webb heard the lock click into place from inside the chamber. The Wellington Club had 11 other members present that evening, scattered throughout the building. Several would later report hearing the sound of voices from private chamber 3 around 8:15 p.m. Not loud enough to make out words, but the rhythm of serious conversation. The club's manager, Edmund Price, passed by the room at approximately 8:30 p.m. and confirmed hearing multiple voices engaged in what sounded like an intense discussion. At 9:17 p.m., silence fell. Several club members would later remark on how absolute the silence was, the kind of silence that makes itself noticed. One member, Judge Theodore Harrison, commented that he'd been reading in the library and suddenly realized he could hear his own heartbeat. That's how quiet the building had become. At 10:45 p.m., Webb became concerned. The 5 men had been inside for nearly 3 hours. He'd seen no one enter or leave. He went upstairs and knocked on the door of private chamber 3. No response. He knocked again, harder, called out. Nothing. Webb fetched Edmund Price, the club manager. Together they knocked and called. The door remained locked from inside. They could see light under the door. The lamps were still burning, but heard absolutely nothing. Price made a decision. At 11:03 p.m., he sent for the locksmith, Jonathan Miller, who lived 3 blocks away. Miller arrived at 11:34 p.m. with his tools. The lock was engaged from inside. Miller could tell someone had deliberately turned the mechanism. He began working carefully, aware he was dealing with club property and wanting to minimize damage. By 11:52 p.m., he had the lock open. Edmund Price opened the door. The room was empty. 5 lamps still burned, their wicks trimmed, fuel sufficient for hours more. 5 chairs remained pushed back from the table, positioned as if their occupants had stood up suddenly. 5 glasses of brandy sat on the table, barely touched. 5 cigars rested in ashtrays. 4 had burned down to ash, but one, Colonel Hartley's, was still smoking, a thin trail of grey rising toward the ceiling. The room's single window was closed and locked from inside. The glass was intact, painted shut years ago and never opened. The walls were solid, covered in thick velvet curtains. The floor was hardwood, no loose boards, no trapdoors. The ceiling was plaster, unblemished. 5 men had entered. The door locked from inside, and now they were gone. But they had left something. Carved into the mahogany table, fresh cuts still showing pale wood beneath the dark finish, was a single word. The letters were crude, gouged deep, as if made with great force and urgency. Below the word were what appeared to be numbers, but they'd been scratched over repeatedly, making them illegible. Around the numbers, someone had carved a series of marks that resembled tally marks, hundreds of them, covering nearly 2 feet of table surface. Edmund Price stared at the scene, his face going pale. Henry Webb, standing behind him, would later tell investigators that the room felt wrong. Not cold, not dark, but wrong in a way he couldn't explain. Like walking into a place where something terrible had just happened, except nothing was disturbed. Everything was exactly where it should be except for the 5 men who should have been there. Price sent Webb to alert the authorities immediately. By 12:30 a.m. on October 24th, Charleston's Chief Constable Daniel Rutherford arrived at the Wellington Club with 4 officers. Rutherford was a methodical man, experienced in dealing with the city's various crimes and disturbances. He'd never encountered anything like this. His investigation began immediately. Every detail was documented. The room measured 16 feet by 20 feet. No hidden passages, no loose panels. The window remained locked from inside, painted shut with multiple layers, clearly unopened for years. Paint chips confirmed this. The door had been locked from inside with the key still in the mechanism. No other exits existed. The 5 cigars were examined, 4 burned to ash. Colonel Hartley's was still smoking when they entered, meaning it had been lit within the past 10 to 15 minutes. Yet the men had been inside with the door locked for over 3 hours. The brandy was tested, nothing unusual, no signs of poison or drugs. The carved word reckoning and the tally marks were documented. A furniture expert would later confirm the marks were fresh, made within the past few hours. Personal effects were found, Colonel Hartley's pocket watch on the table still ticking, Thomas Brennan's leather gloves on his chair. Richard Ashby's portfolio, left closed on the table. Inside were financial documents, plantation records, nothing unusual. William Foster's walking stick leaned against the wall. Marcus Landry's hat hung on the coat rack. Men don't vanish and leave their hats behind. Rutherford interviewed everyone present in the building that evening, 11 club members, 3 staff members including Webb and Price. The locksmith confirmed no one could have left the room while it was locked from inside. No one had seen the 5 men leave. No one had heard anything unusual after 9:17 p.m. when the voices stopped. The investigation expanded. Officers were sent to each man's home. The households of the 5 missing men received visitors in the early hours of October 24th. What Constable Rutherford's officers discovered only deepened the mystery. At Colonel Hartley's residence, they found the colonel's study disturbed. Books pulled from shelves, papers scattered across his desk. But his wife, Eleanor, insisted everything had been normal when she'd last seen him. She led the officers to his study, and her confusion was genuine. She'd been in that room just that afternoon, and it had been perfectly ordered. The colonel was meticulous about his space. More disturbing was what they found in the study's fireplace, partially burned letters, dozens of them. The officers carefully extracted what remained. Most were too damaged to read, but fragments survived. One letter addressed to the colonel contained a single legible sentence. They know about the shipment from March. Someone kept records. The rest was ash. Eleanor Hartley had never seen the letters before. She knew nothing about any shipment. When pressed, she mentioned that her husband had become increasingly withdrawn over the past 3 weeks, since around October 1st. He'd stopped sleeping well. She'd wake to find him standing at the window of their bedroom at odd hours, watching the street below. He seemed afraid, she told the officers, though he would never admit it. At Thomas Brennan's home, officers found his wife, Catherine, distraught. She directed them to his study, where they discovered a locked drawer in his desk had been forced open from inside. The wood splintered, the lock broken outward. The drawer was empty. Catherine insisted her husband was the only one with a key to that drawer, and she'd never known him to break his own furniture. When had this happened? She didn't know. She hadn't entered his study since yesterday morning. In Brennan's bedroom, hidden under the mattress, officers found a loaded pistol and a hand-drawn map. The map showed Charleston Harbor and surrounding waterways, with specific dates written next to certain locations. March 14th, April 3rd, June 22nd, August 15th. No explanation of what the dates meant. Richard Ashby's wife, Margaret, was more composed than the others, but her concern was evident. She led officers to her husband's study, where they found his famous journals, years of meticulous records covering every aspect of his plantation operations. 37 leather-bound volumes arranged chronologically on his shelves. Except one was missing. Margaret confirmed it immediately. The journal from March to September 1844 was gone. Richard had been writing in it as recently as last week. She'd seen it on his desk. Now it wasn't anywhere in the study, and Richard would never have removed it from this room. He was obsessive about keeping his journals organized and accessible. Officers searched the entire house. The journal wasn't found. What they did find, tucked into another journal from 1843, was a loose page covered in Richard's handwriting. It appeared to be a list of names. 47 names, to be exact. All appeared to be names of enslaved people, though not from Ashby's own plantation. Next to each name was a single word: sold or gone. The date at the top of the page was March 18th, 1844. At William Foster's home, his wife, Julia, was waiting for news, pale with worry. She told officers her husband had been struggling with something for months, though he refused to discuss it. He'd been writing late into the night, burning candles until dawn. In his study, they found his private journal, the one Julia mentioned he kept locked, separate from household accounts. It was open on his desk, as if he'd been reading it recently. The last entry was dated October 22nd, the day before his disappearance. I can no longer remain silent. What we have done, what we have all done, demands an answer. The others believe we can bury this like we've buried everything else, but some things won't stay buried. Tomorrow we meet to discuss terms. I intend to tell them I'm going to the authorities. God forgive me for waiting this long. The entries before that were similarly cryptic, referencing the agreement, the arrangement, and what happened in March. Foster wrote of guilt, of sleepless nights, of seeing faces he couldn't forget. Marcus Landry's household was the most unsettling. His house staff reported that young Mr. Landry had become increasingly paranoid over the past 2 weeks. He'd hired additional guards to patrol the property at night. He'd begun locking himself in his bedroom. The sealed letter he'd written to his sister that morning was gone. No one knew where it had been placed, and no one could find it. In Landry's bedroom, officers found something that made them exchange worried glances. Scratch marks on the inside of his door. Deep gouges in the wood, as if someone had clawed at it desperately. The marks were fresh, but the door opened normally, wasn't locked or stuck. Why would someone scratch at a door that opened freely? On his bedside table was a Bible, opened to Revelation chapter 20. A single verse was underlined so hard the pen had torn through the paper. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it. Constable Rutherford coordinated his investigation from the Wellington Club, which had been sealed as a crime scene. By dawn on October 24th, he had compiled his initial findings. 5 men had vanished from a locked room. No rational explanation existed for their disappearance, but the evidence from their homes suggested they'd been involved in something together, something that had begun in March 1844 and had been weighing on them ever since. The dates kept appearing. March 14th, March 18th. Something significant had happened that month. Rutherford was a practical man, not given to superstitious thinking. He didn't believe 5 men had simply dissolved into air. They had left the room somehow, and he would determine how. But as he interviewed more witnesses and gathered more evidence, his certainty began to erode. The club's architectural plans were examined. No hidden passages, no forgotten doorways. The building had been constructed in 1798 and renovated in 1832. All records were available, all modifications documented. Private Chamber 3 was exactly what it appeared to be, a simple rectangular room with 1 door, 1 window, and no secrets. Could the men have escaped before the door was locked? Rutherford traced their movements carefully. Henry Webb's testimony was clear. All 5 men went upstairs. He heard the lock engage at 8:03 p.m. After that, multiple witnesses confirmed hearing voices from the room at various times until 9:17 p.m. The voices had definitely been inside that room for over an hour after the door was locked. The cigar bothered Rutherford more than anything else. Colonel Hartley's cigar had been smoking when they opened the door at 11:52 p.m. Smoking, not burned down to ash like the others, but actively smoldering with a lit ember. That meant it had been puffed on, drawn air, within the past few minutes. Yet no one had been in that room. On October 25th, Rutherford received a visit from a harbor master named George Whitfield. Whitfield had heard about the disappearances and believed he had relevant information. Those 5 men, Whitfield said, sitting in Rutherford's office. They were asking questions down at the docks about 3 weeks ago. All of them, at different times, asking about the same thing. What thing? Rutherford asked. A ship called the Meridian arrived in Charleston Harbor on March 13, 1844, left 3 days later, March 16th. The 5 missing men were all asking about its cargo manifest. Rutherford leaned forward. What was its cargo? Whitfield shifted uncomfortably. Officially, cotton and tobacco bound for Liverpool, but there were rumors the Meridian carried other cargo too, cargo that wasn't documented. In 1844, the international slave trade had been illegal in the United States for decades. But illegal trades still occurred, smuggled and hidden, especially in southern ports where enforcement was lax, and many officials looked the other way. The domestic slave trade remained legal and profitable, but international trafficking was supposed to have ended. "You're saying the Meridian was involved in slave smuggling?" Rutherford asked carefully. "I'm saying there were rumors," Whitfield replied. "Nothing proven. But dock workers talked. They said the Meridian had come from West Africa, made a stop somewhere in the Caribbean, then came to Charleston. They said it sat too low in the water for the cargo it claimed to carry. And they said it left in the middle of the night, very sudden, without the usual procedures." "Why would these 5 plantation owners care about that?" Whitfield looked at the constable directly. "Because they were the investors, sir. Word among the dock workers was that the Meridian's voyage was financed by a group of Charleston planters. The ship was supposed to bring them cargo they couldn't acquire legally anymore. But something went wrong." Rutherford felt cold understanding settle in his chest. "What went wrong?" "The ship arrived nearly empty, sir. Whatever cargo it was supposed to have, it wasn't there. The investors lost a fortune. But more than that, there were stories about what happened to the crew. The Meridian left Charleston with 14 crew members. When it came back, there were only 6. The captain wouldn't say what happened to the others. Wouldn't say anything at all. He took his payment for the voyage and disappeared. The ship left that night and never returned to Charleston. This changed everything. Rutherford began pulling port records immediately. The Meridian had indeed docked in Charleston in March. Its manifest listed cotton and tobacco. The ship was registered out of Baltimore, owned by a trading company that, upon investigation, turned out to be a shell with no real offices and no traceable owners. The 6 crew members who'd returned with the ship had dispersed immediately. Rutherford sent officers to track them down. 3 were found within Charleston, dock workers now taking whatever labor they could get. All 3 refused to discuss the Meridian or its voyage. One became so agitated when questioned that he pulled a knife and had to be restrained. Between shouts and curses, he said only one coherent thing. "What's done is done. The sea took its due, and the rest ain't for speaking." The other 2 crew members were slightly more cooperative, but only barely. Yes, they'd sailed on the Meridian. Yes, the voyage had gone badly. No, they wouldn't discuss details. When pressed about the missing crew members, both men became visibly afraid. One crossed himself repeatedly and mumbled prayers. The other simply walked away, and no amount of legal intimidation would bring him back to answer questions. The remaining 3 crew members had vanished, left Charleston right after the Meridian departed and hadn't been seen since. Rutherford obtained the ship's official log from port records, but it was useless. Bare minimum entries, nothing about the voyage's actual nature or what had happened. The captain's name was listed as Samuel Garrett, a name that appeared in no other shipping records before or after the Meridian's Charleston visit. The man had vanished as completely as the 5 plantation owners. But Rutherford had dates now. The Meridian arrived March 13th. Based on the evidence from the missing men's homes, something significant happened around March 14th to March 18th. That was when everything changed for them. That was when their fear began. On October 28th, 5 days after the disappearances, a man came forward with information. His name was Benjamin Cole, and he worked as a clerk at the Charleston Custom House, responsible for processing import and export documentation. Cole was nervous, sweating despite the cool weather. He told Constable Rutherford he'd been debating whether to come forward, afraid of losing his position or worse. "There was paperwork," Cole said quietly, sitting in Rutherford's office, "about the Meridian. Paperwork that didn't go through normal channels." "Explain," Rutherford said. Cole swallowed hard. On March 15th, Richard Ashby came to the custom house. Not to the main desk. He came specifically to me, asked if we could speak privately. He knew I handled certain sensitive documents that needed to be processed quietly. "You're saying he bribed you?" "Yes, sir." Cole's voice was barely above a whisper. "He paid me to expedite clearance for the Meridian. to overlook certain inspection requirements, and to ensure the ship could leave port without the usual delays. He paid me $200, sir. That's more than I make in 4 months. $200 in 1844 was serious money, enough to make a man look the other way. Did Ashby say why? Rutherford asked. No, sir, but he was scared. I could see it in his eyes. He kept looking over his shoulder, like he thought someone might see him talking to me. He said the ship needed to leave as soon as possible, that every hour it remained in port was dangerous. Dangerous how? He didn't say, but he gave me a sealed envelope and told me if anything happened to him I should open it. He said it contained information that might be important someday. Rutherford sat up straight. Where is this envelope? Cole reached into his coat and produced a sealed envelope, yellowed paper with Ashby's wax seal. I kept it at home, hidden. When I heard he'd vanished, I knew I had to bring it to you. Rutherford broke the seal and read the letter inside. His expression changed as he read, becoming harder, more troubled. When he finished, he read it again, then set it down and looked at Cole. You can't speak of this to anyone, Rutherford said. Do you understand? Not to your wife, not to your friends, not to anyone. Yes, sir. What does it say? It says enough, Rutherford replied. Go home, Mr. Cole. Thank you for your honesty. After Cole left, Rutherford sat alone in his office, reading Ashby's letter a third time. The contents were damning. If you are reading this, something has happened to me. I write this as both confession and evidence. In January 1844, 5 of us, myself, Colonel James Hartley, Thomas Brennan, William Foster, and Marcus Landry, entered into an agreement to finance a voyage. We sought to acquire cargo through means that had become illegal, believing we could circumvent the law through careful planning and discretion. We hired a ship, the Meridian, and a captain willing to undertake the voyage to West Africa. The ship departed in December 1843 with 14 crew. It was to return by February with cargo we would distribute among ourselves. The ship returned on March 13, 1844, but everything had gone wrong. The cargo was gone, all of it, 147 souls, lost in some manner the captain refused to explain clearly. The crew that returned was half what had departed, and those who remained were changed, haunted, broken. The captain told us only that there had been a storm, that the cargo hold had flooded, that they'd done everything they could. But his eyes told a different story. We paid him anyway. We had no choice. We needed him and his crew silent about our involvement. The ship left that night. We thought we were done with it, that we could move on, absorb the financial loss, and be grateful we'd avoided legal consequences. But we were wrong. Strange things began happening. We each received anonymous letters, describing details of the voyage no one outside the crew could know. Messages left at our homes, carved into trees on our properties, whispered by people we couldn't identify. Always the same message, someone knows what we did. More disturbing were the sightings. All 5 of us have seen them, figures at night standing at the edges of our properties. When we approach, they vanish. But we see them clearly enough to know they are the faces of the cargo we tried to buy. The faces of people who died because of our greed. I do not ask for forgiveness. I ask only that the truth be known. If something happens to me, investigate the Meridian. Investigate March 1844. What we did demands accounting. The letter was signed and dated October 20th, 3 days before Ashby vanished. Rutherford sat in the growing darkness of his office, the letter in his hands. He was beginning to understand what had happened, or at least the outline of it. 5 men had financed an illegal slave trading voyage. The voyage had failed catastrophically, resulting in the deaths of 147 enslaved people and 8 crew members. The investors thought they could bury the truth by paying off the survivors and letting the ship disappear. But someone had known. Someone had been sending them messages, haunting them, driving them toward some final confrontation. The word carved in the table, reckoning. The tally marks, Rutherford counted them carefully in his notes. There were 147 distinct marks carved into the table, the same number as the lost cargo. Someone had orchestrated the 5 men's disappearance. But who? And how had they vanished from a locked room? As October turned to November, the investigation intensified. Rutherford's team interviewed hundreds of people, dock workers, ship crews, plantation employees, anyone who might have information about the Meridian or the 5 missing men. Patterns emerged. Multiple enslaved people from the 5 men's plantations reported that their owners had become increasingly paranoid in the weeks before the disappearance. Extra guards were hired. Punishments became more severe for minor infractions, as if the owners were trying to maintain control through fear because they themselves were afraid. Several reported seeing strangers on the properties at night, people who didn't belong, walking the grounds after dark. When confronted, these strangers would disappear into the darkness. Guards reported the same thing, figures that seemed to melt away when pursued. One woman named Ruth, enslaved on Hartley's plantation, told an investigator something chilling. On the night of October 22nd, the night before the disappearances, she'd been awakened by singing. Multiple voices coming from somewhere beyond the main house, singing in languages she didn't recognize. African languages, she thought, but not ones she knew. The singing lasted for hours, stopping just before dawn. When she mentioned it to the overseer the next morning, he'd struck her and told her she'd imagined it. But other enslaved people on Hartley's plantation confirmed hearing the same thing, singing in the night, in languages that felt both foreign and familiar. Similar reports came from the other 4 plantations. On the nights leading up to October 23rd, unexplained phenomena, singing, figures moving in the darkness, a sense of building pressure, like a storm about to break. Rutherford interviewed the families more extensively. Colonel Hartley's wife mentioned that in the week before his disappearance, her husband had become obsessed with locks. He'd gone through the house checking every lock, installing new ones, even nailing some windows shut. He'd moved his pistol from the study to his bedroom, kept it loaded on his nightstand. He wouldn't tell me what he was afraid of, Eleanor Hartley said, but I could see it in his face. He was terrified. Thomas Brennan's wife revealed that her husband had tried to book passage on a ship to England in mid-October. He'd been planning to leave Charleston, possibly permanently, but had changed his mind at the last moment. When she asked why, he'd said only, "Running won't work. It will follow us anywhere." What would follow them? He wouldn't say. The investigation uncovered another detail. On October 15th, all 5 men had received identical packages delivered anonymously. The packages contained sand, just plain sand, the kind found on beaches. But mixed in the sand were small fragments of wood, rotted and weathered by seawater, and bone fragments. Human bone fragments, later confirmed by a medical examiner. The message was clear. The sea had taken the cargo, but pieces remained. Someone had collected them and sent them back. Rutherford pursued every lead, no matter how strange. He interviewed mystics and root workers, people who claimed knowledge of spiritual matters. Most were charlatans, but a few provided insights that troubled him. An elderly woman named Adeline, who had a reputation in Charleston's black community for knowing things, told him, "What goes into the water don't always stay there, Constable. Sometimes the water gives it back. Sometimes the dead walk back to shore, looking for justice they were denied." Rutherford didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural vengeance, but he couldn't deny the evidence. 5 men, guilty of causing the deaths of 147 people, had vanished in a manner that defied rational explanation. The timing, the symbolism, the impossibility of their disappearance from a locked room, it all pointed to something beyond normal crime. On November 8th, Rutherford received news that stopped his investigation cold. A ship had run aground near Charleston Harbor. A fishing crew discovered it at dawn, wedged on a sandbar about a mile offshore. The ship was old, damaged, partially submerged. Its name was barely visible on the hull. Meridian Rutherford assembled a team immediately. They took a boat to the sandbar where the Meridian had grounded. The ship was in terrible condition, hull cracked, masts broken, rigging tangled. It looked like it had been at sea in storms for months, maybe years, despite having left Charleston only 8 months earlier. The smell was overwhelming. Death and rot and seawater mixed into something that made strong men gag. The ship sat low in the water, clearly taking on leaks but held in place by the sandbar. They boarded carefully, aware the deck might collapse. The wood was soft with rot, treacherous underfoot. Rutherford led 3 officers and a ship's carpenter named Thomas Gray, who could assess the vessel's condition. The main deck was a disaster. Cargo boxes broken open and empty, barrels smashed, everything covered in a thick layer of sediment and decay. But no bodies, no sign of crew or cargo. They descended into the hold. The cargo hold was where enslaved people would have been kept during the voyage, chained, packed in inhumane conditions, subjected to horrors that the law had supposedly outlawed but that continued in practice. The hold was dark, lit only by the lanterns the investigators carried. What they found made them understand why the crew had returned broken. The hold was full of chains. Not just chains, shackles, all connected, all still locked, arranged in the patterns used to restrain human cargo. But the shackles were empty. 147 sets of chains, all locked, all empty. How does someone escape locked chains? How do 147 people escape locked chains simultaneously? Gray examined the shackles closely. These weren't picked, he said. Weren't broken. They're locked properly from the outside. But there's no one in them. On the walls of the hold, messages had been carved into the wood. Hundreds of marks, words in multiple languages. Rutherford couldn't read most of them, but he recognized some patterns. Names, perhaps. Prayers, maybe. Records of people who had been here. And one message in English carved deep into a support beam. The water answered. They searched the rest of the ship. In the captain's cabin, they found the ship's log. The real log, not the sanitized version filed with port authorities. The final entries were dated March 14th, 1844. Third day out of harbor. Storm hit yesterday evening. Worst I've seen in 30 years at sea. Cargo hold flooded before we could secure it. Water came up so fast, like the ocean was trying to swallow the ship whole. By the time we got the hold open, they were gone. All of them. 147 people and not a single body. The chains were still locked. The hold was full of seawater but no bodies. How is that possible? Crew is panicking. They're saying the sea took them, that the ocean demanded payment for what we were doing. Superstitious nonsense, but I can't explain it either. We've lost Johnson, Peters, Mackenzie, Walsh, Davis, Montgomery, Pike, and Reed. Washed overboard in the storm, or so I thought. But Matthews swears he saw Johnson below deck this morning, standing in the flooded hold, just standing there with water up to his chest. When Matthews called out, Johnson didn't respond, just stood there staring, then sank down into the water and was gone. I don't believe in ghosts, but something is wrong with this ship. The log ended there. No more entries. The Meridian had somehow limped back to Charleston, delivered its crew of survivors, then disappeared back to sea. And now it had returned, empty and rotting, as if the ocean had finished with it. Rutherford's team searched every inch of the vessel. In the crew quarters they found personal effects left behind. Clothes, tools, religious items, everything covered in that same sediment, that same smell of rot and seawater. But they found something else too. In a small storage locker near the captain's cabin, wrapped in oilcloth and somehow preserved despite the ship's condition, were 5 leather pouches. Each pouch contained a substantial amount of gold coins, the payment the 5 investors had given to the captain and crew for their silence, and each pouch had a name carved into the leather: Hartley, Brennan, Ashby, Foster, Landry. The money they'd paid to bury their crime had returned with the ship. Rutherford stood on the deck of the Meridian, watching the sun set over Charleston harbor, and felt the weight of everything settling into place. 5 men had financed a voyage of human trafficking. 147 people died as a result, drowned in a flooded hold, their bodies never recovered. The crew, traumatized and broken, had been paid to keep silent. The investors thought they'd escaped consequence. But someone had known. Someone had been haunting them, leaving messages, building toward the night of October 23rd, when all 5 men gathered in a locked room and vanished without explanation. Rutherford had no rational explanation for how they disappeared. But standing on the deck of this death ship, feeling the way it seemed to settle deeper into the sandbar as if trying to pull itself back into the sea, he understood that some crimes demanded answers beyond what the law could provide. The Meridian was towed to Charleston's naval yard and secured. Rutherford filed his report with the city authorities, documenting everything he'd discovered. The case of the 5 missing plantation owners was officially classified as unsolved, though Rutherford's report made clear his belief that their disappearance was directly connected to their financing of an illegal slave voyage that had resulted in 147 deaths. The disappearance of 5 prominent plantation owners sent shockwaves through Charleston's society. The families demanded answers, threatened legal action, hired private investigators. But no additional evidence was ever found. The room at the Wellington Club was examined by experts from as far away as Boston. Structural engineers, architects, even a stage magician who specialized in exposing fraudulent spiritualists. No one could explain how 5 men had left a room locked from the inside, leaving behind only their personal effects and a freshly smoking cigar. The table with its carved word, reckoning, and its 147 tally marks was kept as evidence. The Wellington Club eventually closed that room permanently, unable to rent it to members who found it deeply unsettling. The 5 widows faced financial difficulties. The investments their husbands had made in the Meridian represented substantial sums, money that was never recovered. The families filed claims against the ship's owners, but the company was a shell that dissolved into legal nothing. The Charleston courts eventually ruled the families had no recourse. More quietly, rumors spread through Charleston's enslaved communities. Stories of 5 powerful men who had tried to traffic in human lives and had been called to account. The stories varied in details, but carried the same message. Justice exists beyond the laws written by men. In December 1844, the Meridian sank at its moorings in the naval yard. No storm, no obvious damage. The ship simply settled into the water overnight and was gone by morning. Attempts to raise it failed. It's still there, buried in harbor mud, a grave marker for 147 people whose names were never recorded in official histories. Throughout the winter of 1844-1845, investigators continued searching for the 5 missing men. Bodies never surfaced. No witnesses came forward with credible sightings. It was as if the men had been erased from existence, leaving only the mystery of their final night and the evidence of what they'd done. Benjamin Cole, the custom house clerk, died in February 1845, found drowned in shallow water near the docks. The official verdict was accidental death, but there were no witnesses, and the circumstances were suspicious. Some believed he'd been silenced for what he knew. Others thought guilt over his role had driven him to take his own life. The 3 surviving Meridian crew members who'd been found in Charleston all left the city within weeks of the ship's reappearance. None were ever located again. The documentary trail suggests they changed their names and disappeared into other port cities, trying to escape whatever haunted them. One member of the Meridian's crew did resurface years later. In 1852, a sailor in Boston named William Thatcher, dying of pneumonia, gave a deathbed confession to a priest. Thatcher claimed he'd been on the Meridian in March 1844. He described the storm, the flooded hold, the impossible disappearance of the chained cargo, but he added details that had never been publicly reported. According to Thatcher, in the days after the storm, the surviving crew members experienced shared nightmares. Every night, they'd dream of drowning, of being chained in darkness while water rose around them. They'd wake, gasping, choking, convinced they were actually drowning. Some nights, they'd wake to find seawater in their bunks, despite being on a dry ship under clear skies. Thatcher said the crew believed the cargo, those 147 people who died in the hold, weren't gone. They were with the ship, in the ship, part of the ship now, watching, waiting. The priest who heard Thatcher's confession recorded it and sent it to authorities in Charleston. By then, 8 years had passed since the disappearances. The case was cold. Rutherford had retired. No one followed up. The families of the 5 missing men eventually moved on with their lives. Widows remarried, children grew up. Plantations were sold or managed by others. Time did what it always does. It buried the past under layers of new present moments. But in Charleston, the story persisted. The Wellington Club incident became local legend. The night 5 men vanished from a locked room. Students at the College of Charleston studied it as an unsolved mystery. Journalists periodically revisited the case, hoping to find new evidence. No one ever did. In the spring of 1846, a different kind of visitor came to Charleston. His name was Frederick Bailey, though he would later be better known by another name. He was traveling through the South, gathering information, making contacts, building the network that would eventually help enslaved people escape to freedom. While in Charleston, he heard the story of the 5 plantation owners who had vanished. He spoke with some of the enslaved people from their plantations, conversations that were dangerous for everyone involved, but happened nevertheless in quiet moments, in hidden places. What they told him wasn't part of any official record. They told him about the singing in the nights before the disappearances, about the figures that walked the properties after dark, about a woman named Eliza, who worked in Hartley's kitchen, and who had, the morning after the disappearances, been found standing at the property line, staring toward Charleston, with tears streaming down her face. When asked what was wrong, Eliza had said only, "They came back." They found what they were looking for. Who came back? She wouldn't say, but she seemed peaceful, relieved, as if a great weight had been lifted. Bailey recorded these conversations in his private notes. Years later, in his autobiography, he would write briefly about Charleston, about the strange account of plantation masters who seemed to have been swallowed by their own sins. He didn't include details, perhaps understanding that some stories are too dangerous to tell fully in an era when slavery still existed and power still protected power. The truth about what happened on October 23, 1844, in Private Chamber 3 of the Wellington Club, remained unknown. 5 men entered a locked room and never came out. Their fate became Charleston's most enduring mystery. But perhaps the mystery is itself the answer. Perhaps the point isn't what happened to 5 guilty men, but what their disappearance represented. Evidence that some debts demand payment, that some crimes are too great to be buried or bought off, that justice exists in forms that can't be stopped by locked doors or social position or the protection of unjust laws. The Meridian remains in Charleston Harbor, buried under silt and time. On foggy nights, sailors sometimes report seeing lights near where the ship went down, ghostly illuminations that move beneath the water's surface. Fishermen avoid the area, claiming their nets always come up empty there, or worse, tangled with chains. The room at the Wellington Club was eventually demolished when the building was renovated in 1871. The table with its carved word and tally marks was saved, stored in a warehouse. In 1886, the warehouse burned in the Great Charleston Fire. The table was lost, but the story remained, still remains. The Charleston incident, the night 5 plantation owners vanished, a mystery without solution, a disappearance without explanation. Unless you understand that some explanations exist beyond what can be proven in courts or written in official reports. Unless you accept that 147 people who died in chains in a flooded hold might have found a way to hold their killers accountable. Unless you believe that the ocean, having taken so much, might have given something back, not the dead themselves, but the justice they were denied. On clear nights in Charleston, you can stand at the harbor and look out over the water, the same water that carried those suffering ships, the same water that took 147 souls whose names were never recorded, whose lives were considered cargo, whose deaths were treated as financial loss rather than human tragedy. The water is still there, still moving, still holding its secrets. And somewhere beneath its surface, the Meridian waits, a monument to the truth that some crimes stain deeper than time can wash away, that some reckonings come regardless of locked doors or the protection of privilege, that justice, denied in life, finds ways to manifest that no law can prevent and no power can stop. 5 men vanished on October 23, 1844. They were never found. And perhaps that, in itself, is exactly the ending their story deserved.